Are you following much about what's happening in Sri Lanka? I assume you're aware.
Yeah, to some extent, basically, yeah, they're having a currency crisis and an energy crisis,
Yeah.
and that's an example of what can happen. It starts at the periphery, countries that are either not economically secure, energy secure, and then you can have mayhem and you can have people suffer because they're not able to get the resources that they need. And generally, a lot of these revolutions, the catalyst ends up being that food and fuel prices spike, right? So, you have an unstable situation, but that it's good enough because people are able to get the food they need, they get the energy they need. So they're like, well, I'm not going to go out in the streets, even though I don't like the situation. But then when they can't even do that anymore, they're like, I'm going out in the streets. And so that's why a lot of these revolutions tend to happen in rising commodity price environments.
Civil unrest. I think you talked about it with me before, civil unrest, and that's followed by populism.
Yes.
Interesting. I was tracking Sri Lanka. I think Stefan Rivera shared a video. I was watching a news article, and I'm pretty sure they got to the point where they ran out of money to secure their oil purchases, or to be able to pay off their oil debt. So they got to the point where the country had no fuel left.
Yeah, they're very low in capital. That's the whole thing. If you don't have sufficient reserves, sufficient savings, and then you encounter a crisis, you can literally run out of things. And so we're seeing that in a number of places, and Sri Lanka's kind of on the forefront of that, unfortunately.
Yeah. Do we even know how a country? Well, you probably know. How does a country like Sri Lanka get out of this? Is it new loans with the World Bank? Do they have new agreements with the IMF? What happens in a situation like this?
Well, yeah, you can have humanitarian organizations come in. You can have these big government types of organizations come in and do loans and things like that. Or they just kind of go through mayhem, and if there's some pockets that are able to get capital and keep operating, but it's a very dangerous environment. There's no easy way out. If you're building up a capital base from nothing, that's very hard to do. They basically have to bootstrap all over again, and it's super challenging.
It's a convergence of so many bad things: high amounts of debt,
Yes.
high inflation, war, energy crisis. But I'm trying to understand myself. Are they all related, or some? I mean, obviously, a war that ideally wouldn't have happened, and for some of us that was a bit of a surprise, came out of nowhere. But that is compounding the effects of these already very difficult situations.
I think a lot of them are related. There's that whole book, Fourth Turning.
Fourth Turning
and that
ends in a war.
And the reason I like that book is because I focus on the quantitative side, and so I look at the long-term debt cycle, which was a topic popularized by Ray Dalio.
Yeah.
And if you just look at the fourth turnings and the long-term debt cycles, it's the same cycle, right? So one's describing the quantitative aspect of what's happening, one's describing the qualitative happening. And for example, if you look at the 1930s and 40s, during the Great Depression, you had a collapse of the private debt bubble. And you started to get around the world rising populism. And you started to get countries, you basically, as the pie stopped growing, people fight harder over the remaining pie. And so you had countries were doing all sorts of trade, frictions with each other, trying to get trade advantages over each other, making less and less free trade. And you had inside countries, you had rising populist movements. And especially obviously became really bad in Germany and parts of Europe. And then you had that in Japan. And then that eventually broke out into war. And then you had this more inflationary environment where all these countries were going all out with their fiscal expenditures to try to get resources and win the war. And so it wasn't just like these things all randomly happened. It's like you had kind of a series of things lead into each other. And so I've used the 2010s and 2020s analog comparing to the 1930s and 40s because in the 2010s, or really in 2008, but for the most part, we went through it in the 2010s, we had a popping of a private debt bubble. So you had, in the U.S. and elsewhere, you had kind of a lot of private debt, get wiped out, and people lost their homes, and you had this kind of stagnation environment that looked a lot like the 30s, except without a dust bowl. And we did it in an era of smartphones and things like that, and we had more money printing, so it was less deflationary. But it was just kind of like this stagnation with just better technology. And then the 2020s are shaping up to be a lot like the 40s, where you have an external catalyst comes along, in this case, a virus, and then lockdowns, and then, the fiscal response to keep people solving through that. So we print a lot of money after a period of having low commodity prices and underinvestment. and we're kind of going into the 40s. And the one thing I hope I wasn't sure we'd see the same level of kinetic type of things we saw in the prior 40s. I wasn't trying to call for a war comparison. I was calling for a fiscal and inflation and commodity comparison. But it's kind of inevitable that you get these types of conflicts. And so in this environment where the pie is not growing, you're more likely to get conflicts. And then those conflicts can ironically make the pie even smaller, right? Because now it's less efficient to move things around. And so it actually, in many ways, makes the crisis worse.
Yeah, it's quite interesting with regards to what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. I've had people on the podcast to discuss this, and there's a couple of schools of thought where one school of thought is Russia is invading a sovereign currency, and Putin has some desire to kind of reunite the USSR. And there's another school of thought whereby it's a NATO expansion, there's a threat to Russia. But an interesting thing that's happened with one of my friends, he's married to a Russian lady, and he has money in Russia. And he said, he contacted me a few weeks back, I can't remember when. He said, I need to get my money out of Russia. He was very fearful of what was going to happen to the currency. And he said, can I do this with Bitcoin? I said, well, that's one way. And, if you want to maintain stability, then you need to convert it to Bitcoin, send it, and sell it immediately. And he was finding it so difficult to get the money out, he didn't. And I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago. He said, my money's actually worth more. Like, he had an expectation the ruble was going to crash, but actually it's not. His money's worth a lot more now. And I was wondering, what is there a third school of thought? Is this another strategic move to make the Russian currency stronger, or is this just some weird effect that nobody expected?
I think a lot of it's tied into energy, right? So if you have a country that doesn't export enough, then no amount of capital controls can really maintain the value of that currency. It's just going to collapse. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have a country that exports things that the world needs, like Russia, they have a big chunk of not just energy, but also nickel, wheat, fertilizer. They have a big chunk of the resources that the world needs. So the world needs it, and the world sanctioned them. So they have less ability to import now, but their exports are still desired, and the prices of those exports went up. So the dollar value of their exports is higher. So actually their current account surplus, their trade surplus spiked because you simultaneously reduce their imports and increase their exports value-wise. And so you have this, it's almost like a short squeeze where it's real, but it's also partially affected by these sanctions and capital controls and things like that. And it kind of comes down to the fact that at the end of the day, currency is a claim on the resources of that country.
Yeah.
And Russia does have a lot of resources. And resources doesn't just mean natural resources. It also means labor resources and infrastructure resources. In Russia's case, a lot of it's natural resources. And so they have cards to play because, Europe can say what they want, and then Russia can say, okay, we're going to shut your gas off. And unless you pay and unless you, do our terms. And so there's this very challenging, it's not an easy playing field. The West has advantages, but Russia also has key resources. And, I don't go into the whole political thing of it. I'm not in favor of war. I'm not in favor of what Russia's doing here at all. Mm-hmm. And so, I'm very supportive of the people in Ukraine. And one of the things at the Human Rights Foundation, we had activists there from Ukraine and Russia. There are people there that were, say, Putin oppositionists. They're in favor of democracy in Russia, like real democracy, not like fake democracy.
Yeah.
Like not where journalists and political opponents get jailed and killed and things like that.
Bullets in the head and fall off balconies. And
yeah.
Was it Navalny? Is it 9 years he's just been sentenced?
Yeah. Someone from his organization was at the Freedom Forum. I met her. And so, it's not really, it doesn't have to be about the people. It's about regimes playing chess with their people's lives. And especially what Russia's doing. It's a terrible situation for human rights in general.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels like I don't know how this ends. It feels like it's all down to a small number of people's egos. It
often comes down to things like that. And I mean, and I know people will push back and say, because the United States, we've done a lot of atrocities around the world too.
Of course. When
you have these centralized areas of power, they go out and they can exert their will on other countries. It's unfortunate.
The British too.
British have done it.
A long history. People remind me.